Hello and welcome back to Flying Solo, the series that continues to be the most infrequent of the various series that we have going on this podcast. I'm back again to continue into my second part of the books that I read in 2024. This is once again your host, Caleb. And on my previous section of this, I discussed the books that were part of my ongoing series during 2024, my ongoing reading playlist, To Your Scattered Bodies Go, The Stars. And now I'm going to continue just discussing all the books that I went through that weren't a part of that series. And for anyone who listened to the first part of this two-part discussion, I mentioned in that for each section of my To Your Scattered Bodies Go series, I had them in blocks where I would do 3 books from that series, and then I would try to, as a way to encourage myself, I would write a little footnote that would say sidestep, read something not a part of this series before you continue. And I had 7 sections, and for each part, I would read, what was intended to be 1 book in between, or maybe 2 books, but they ended up being a lot more. So I will mention when there's a separation there, and I don't know, maybe that doesn't matter, but it's just part of how I did it. So, but the first book in my series was actually the first book that I read this year. I read this one solely on my Kobo in print. This was a book that my partner, Brianna, recommended. She mentioned a few times and was like, I really think that you'd like this book. You should really check it out. It was called If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. It was published in 2023, written by Noor Naga. This was a really great book. It had this unusual style. It was told from 2 different POVs, very drastically different POVs. Brief little summary is about an American girl coming to Egypt, and her family was Egyptian. She was Egyptian by heritage, but not Egyptian by nationality. And so coming there, she had a bit of a culture shock and had kind of even though she felt like an outsider back home in America, she was also treated as an outsider when she returned back to the place where her family was from. And actually, I think she was actually Canadian now I think about it. I think she was a Canadian in the book. But either way. And she came from a wealthier background and had an element of privilege to her. And she winds up getting entangled with this Egyptian who was from the lowest of the economic rung. And his perspective was disturbing at times. Some of his backstory stuff and just some of the direction they take with him, I thought was really sad and interesting and really poignant. A lot of interesting observations. And it just had a unique kind of, I want to say visual language, I guess literary language of its own that felt unique to the book. And it was just a very rewarding experience. It did have a very odd ending that I could see throwing some people off. I found it like it added something. It made the book have a more compelling element that left me thinking about it. And me and my partner discussed it a few times, wondering what exactly we're supposed to get from that ending. And I think there's a lot of good food for thought. And it's a book that I would give a very hearty recommend. If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, Noor Naga, definitely check that one out. I gave that one an 8.2. As I mentioned in the first part, I rated all these books in a 10-point scale, and I also wrote little mini reviews. And so I'll continue mentioning that throughout. Next, I read in print as well, also my Kobo, the book that me and Brianna recorded as our favorite books of the year for 2023. Her favorite book of that year was I Who Have Never Known Men, released in 1995, written by Jacqueline Hartman. And so, of course, because of that podcast together, I read that book. So I won't repeat too much, but excellent piece of bleak science fiction, very grim at times, but just a beautiful reflection and treatise on what it means to be a human, what makes someone human. And a bit too grim to be a book that I return to very often, but it's definitely one that I'm looking forward to getting a chance to live with again. Beautifully written, lots of interesting observations in philosophy, and just, the kind of book that if you're a fan of science fiction, if you're a fan of just good literature, that's one that you want on your shelf and one that you want to have read. So high recommend. That's absolute classic in my mind. I Who Have Never Known Men. I gave that one a 9.7. So overall, I think I mentioned in my previous one, my favorite book of my list, To Your Scattered Bodies Go the Stars, was Green Mars. That was, it wasn't really close, I mean, of course, God Emperor of Dune is close. God Emperor of Dune I may like more, but just in terms of kind of like new experiences, it was the one that blew me out of the water the most. And I actually don't know. I don't know if I like God Emperor or Green Mars more. That's a tough one. I'm not going to compare too much because it's difficult for me to think, but Green Mars and I Who Have Never Known Men both got the highest of scores, I think, on this list, which was a 9.7. So very much loved that. Next, this one I read about 10% in print, 90% in audio, was Piranesi from 2020, written by Susanna Clark. Also, I read this one for the same reason as my previous one. Me and Brianna were doing our podcast and our favorites of 2023. This was my favorite book that I read of 2023. Had a really cool epistolary style to it. It had this interesting, beautiful, fragmented world that the character was inhabiting. I loved spending time there. I loved spending time in Piranesi's mind, seeing their worldview. It was just a beautiful little piece of fantasy / science fiction. And strong recommend. I gave that one a 9.0. Really, really like that book. I think that if you're just looking for kind of a light, hopeful piece of science fiction, it should definitely hit the mark for you. And it was funny that me and Brianna both picked two books that involved characters that had been trapped for reasons that they didn't know and had to kind of find their own way to humanity in isolation. It was an interesting pairing, actually. So almost a good double bill. Next on the list, and this started because of in 2023 me reading Aliens Phalanx at the end of the year. I think I read that one in November. And so during 2024, I went on a pretty gigantic alien kind of binge reading, really. I think I ended up walking away from 2024 after never having read an aliens book. I read 9 in 2024, not including Aliens Phalanx, so that's 10 altogether out of the 23 that they've published so far. And also I read one of the Alien vs. Predator books. So it was actually 10 books in 2024 that I read that were alien related. So I was going crazy. But the first one on this list was the prequel tie-in book for the game Alien Firestorm, which I didn't realize at first. I just picked up the book on audio, and I was going through it, and I found that out after the fact. It's called Aliens Infiltrator, released in 2021, and written by Weston O'Chase. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. This was a solid Aliens book. I would say it's more straight down the middle. It features elements and themes that you can find throughout most of the Alien books, at least ones I've read, and several of the movies. It takes place in an enclosed kind of ship environment. I can't remember exactly if Aliens Infiltrator took place in a ship. Again, this was very early in the year when I read this one, and because I've gone through so many Alien books, this one doesn't necessarily stand out. But it dealt with Weyland-Yutani doing some experiment stuff, and one of the standout things was they created this kind of albino alien. And some of the stuff with that one is like an alpha was pretty cool. I liked the characters. There were some cool moments with what it would mean to be a scientist in that environment, because one of the main characters, a character that we see in Alien Firestorm, I think his name was Honecker. He's kind of dealing with the fact that he's been put in a situation that he didn't really expect to be in and having to make do in this very ugly situation. A lot of that stuff I liked. There's some solid horror moments, but there was also some annoying stuff with the Colonial Marines, especially. Some of them on the base were just, they got to the point that I just could not stand to hear the word Colonial Marine said again. It was getting so annoying. And they were all so kind of worshipy of the core. Like, oh, there's nothing more important than being a Colonial Marine. It makes you part of a secret, brotherhood and all this stuff. That was just some of the stuff that I find annoying in military fiction in general, but was dialed up to 11. So that was a little bit annoying. But overall, straight down the middle, solid Aliens book. I give this one a 6.3. Next, this one was just a novella, read it in print, also for the podcast, because me, Johnny, and Isaac, as Johnny's pick, went through Algernon Blackwood's 1907 novella, The Willows. Really good little novella, great imagery, good creepy mood. You'll be walking away thinking about this one for a good little while, and a strong recommend here. I gave this one 7.1, and yeah, just an effective little piece of short fiction, and it actually inspired me to read another book, which I'll get to shortly. So then we went to my next block. That one was the one where I ended with Children of Dune. I read another Aliens book, this one in print. I was reading it every night for, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks or something like that, 3 weeks. And this one was called Aliens Original Sin, published in 2005. It was actually the first of the brand new line, basically the first original Aliens novel, because the first batch of Alien novels that Dark Horse did, those ones were just based on comic books that Dark Horse had written previously. They were basically doing novelizations of those comic book runs. And so Aliens Original Sin was the first kickoff of the brand new line that's sort of continued up to this day. There's been some publisher changes, some kind of direction changes, but otherwise it's been ongoing ever since then, pretty much. Aliens Original Sin, written by Michael Jan Friedman. This was a pretty flawed book. It was a sequel to Alien Resurrection, set after it, featuring the Betty crew and Ripley, and clone Ripley. And it was written and released 8 years after the release of that film. So it's kind of like that film was already received with some mixed reception, and now you're starting your brand new line of Alien novels, riding the coattails of that book 8 years later. And it was a weird choice. And there's a lot of weird stuff in this. I won't get into spoilers, but they start inserting some stuff into canon that is very questionable, really eye-raising stuff. Makes you just wonder what the hell they were thinking. And that I did not enjoy. There's some weird character moments. There's a character that's kind of like a secret asshole spy infiltrator who tries to join the Betty crew. And the whole time, it seemed like you were supposed to hate this character, and I did. Until at the very end, they give him this weird redemption, and we're supposed to turn around and be like, oh my gosh, look at this guy, a hero. And I just kept scratching my head like, what are you thinking? How do you think this is going to work after all the things you've done to make me despise this character? Maybe that's a bit of spoilers, actually. But there's really corny stuff. But the actual, once we got to the real alien threat, it took place in this cool little moon colony that was all jungly. And that stuff was really effective. Some really great aliens horror. I loved the setting. It felt fresh and new. Mind you, this was only my third Aliens book, so I was still, I hadn't seen that much. But this one, that alien stuff did stand out. And actually, the first facehugger scene that we see in the book was one of the most effective, I thought. It was so well realized, so horrific. I thought that was one of the best versions of a facehugger that I'd encountered so far in terms of, in print and in actually experiencing it from a character. Of course, you can never really do that in film because you can't be in a character's head the same way. So overall, I would read this again, actually, and despite some stuff that really made me raise my eyebrows and really made me worried that I was not going to enjoy the book, the stuff that they needed to get right, all the alien stuff, I thought was good enough to just carry me through that bad stuff. And there was also just some awkward writing in terms of trying to, especially Johnner. Oh man, that character is already obnoxious, but feels like it was doubly obnoxious in this book. But still, I gave it a 6.2. It still got over the line. So, Aliens Original Sin, not as bad as you might think. Next, after several failed attempts in print, going on probably 12, 15 years now, I'd finally finished Dracula, 1897, written by Bram Stoker. Yeah, this book, it was just tough in print. I really enjoyed the Jonathan stuff. I've read that stuff 4 times up to this point, maybe 5 times even, but I could just never get through all the stuff with Lucy and Mina sending letters back and forth, all the kind of romance middle. I always would get stopped around 150 to 200 pages. In between that little section, in between there, it would always just stop dead in its tracks for me, and I could never get through it. but the audio version with a full cast, and again, if you've never read Dracula, it's an epistolary fiction told in journal entries and letters, and even things like telegrams and like ship manifests. And for each entry, for each new perspective that we see, we get a new person coming in, giving a new voice. So that made it easier as well, because especially with Lucy and her three suitors, it was easy to kind of be like, okay, which suitor are we with now? Which character is this? And having the different voices there really helped differentiate, really helped give them kind of a personality of their own in my head. And they brought in some fun narrators in there. Some of the performances are really great in that book. And just overall, I thought it was a fantastic production, and it really made me see that, even though I did still get bogged down a little bit with some of the Mina and Lucy letters, once we got past that, it just got really good again. And there was some really great stuff in that latter half of that book. And so I'm tempted to return to it in print again and see if I can, since I already know that the Lucy and Mina letters aren't going to be the majority of the book, maybe I'll be able to just get past that a little bit easier. Because I did always really enjoy the Jonathan section in Dracula's Castle. Some of that stuff is just so great. So I was very happy to finish it. Yeah, just came away really happy. The only thing I would say is I did feel like the climax was a bit protracted, and I thought that, I don't know if it needed to happen at the end or somewhere in that middle section. I feel like a more conservative editor would have gotten the best stuff out of this book. As it is, it's a little bit flabby, but still really good, I would say. I gave it a 7.2. Next, continuing to my next Aliens book, you're seeing a theme that'll continue all the way to the end of this list. I listened in audio to Aliens Prototype, published in 2019 and written by Tim Wagoner. Hopefully that's how you say his name. And this was actually a really cool book. Aliens Prototype once again played with similar themes we've all seen in alien stuff before. This one took place on a scientific colony, and once again, corporate scientists getting their hands on aliens and fucking things up for everyone else. But one of the really cool things here is the people who were experimenting with the aliens, they ended up using the wrong person to infect with the aliens. Someone who had previously had this skin disease that they'd given him. It was someone that they just kept paying to come in and be like, okay, come in, we'll do some experiments on you, we'll give you money. And then I'm giving him this flesh-eating disease. And they thought that they had treated it. They thought that it had gone away. But really it was just, he became a carrier. And so when he became infected with the alien, he created a new type of alien called the necromorph, which is an alien that's fused with a disease. And that disease is turned not only into a new weapon that it can give people this flesh-eating disease when it touches them, but it's always in agony. And so it's suffering. It's like keeps melting and then regenerating. And it's just in an absolute rage. And that is a bit of spoilers, but I think that's the hook that tells you right there. This book has a little bit of a different angle going on and some new types of horror, and it gets really horrific. I think that some of the horror stuff here is just great. And we also get a lot of alien POV in this book, which is a little bit rare. And I mostly liked some of that stuff, but I never like to see too much behind the curtain with the aliens. I never like to really get an idea of too much of what they're thinking or what they are. So that I didn't necessarily love, but overall I thought this book delivered on the scares, delivered on the horror, while still very much playing in the alien tropes, not really branching out and giving us too much new. It gave us just enough for me to tip this thing over a little bit. And also I got to be introduced to the character Zulu Hendrix, who I'd never heard of before, but turns out has a long history in the Alien comics. She also was friends with Ellen Ripley's daughter, and we get actually a scene in the early sections of the book featuring that character, Amanda Ripley. So that was kind of cool. But overall, very solid Aliens book. Not necessarily a big standout, but I did give that thing a 6.4, so definitely still a solid little kind of action adventure horror novel. But continuing with the Aliens trend, I read this was another one that I read in the evening in print, right before bed every night. For this one, not very long. I got through this thing really fast. It was Aliens DNA War, published in 2006 and written by Diane Carey. And this one, 5 books deep at that point in my Aliens journey, this was my second favorite entry after Aliens Phalanx. Like my first favorite, DNA War is the only Aliens novel that I encountered up to that point that really felt distinctly of its own accord. It didn't feel like it was riffing on other material that we'd seen in the Aliens franchise. It didn't take place in some spacecraft or space base or even a colony on any planet. This was just a group of hippies hiding out on basically unknown planet, a planet that had a lot of interesting, unique features to it. It the way it interacted with heat and sand, it was constantly making these like glass crystalline structures all over the place. So they'd have like these glass trees and things like that, and it created some really cool imagery, especially when it came to the aliens, where you could be like hiding behind one of them, and well, I won't spoil too much, but either way, some really fantastic imagery. And another really interesting thing about this book that I'm sure might piss some alien fans off is it really played into the alien aspect of the xenomorph and the insect element, and in ways that again radically kind of change how you think of them, change the view of them. And for me, the aliens, I feel like in these books especially, and maybe in the films, you could do a lot to, because there's such a mystery. You could really do a lot to change them, how we view them, and it wouldn't necessarily bother me. I'm sure it would bother some people, but at least in this book, yeah, it got really out there, and I thought some of that stuff was really cool, and I really liked the setting especially. I just thought the planet was so excellent as the way to make the franchise feel new again after reading 4 books in this series that really all felt like they were the same. Even Aliens Original Sin, which felt the most different out of the 4 between Aliens Phalanx and DNA War, it still fell into a lot of the similar tropes that we'd seen previously. The only thing I didn't necessarily like about this one is Diane Carey. Some of her dialogue work was just a bit clumsy and a little bit unnatural. They throw in this romance that doesn't really work, in my opinion. And occasionally our lead, who's this cop character, who, clearly he has a lot of trauma with his mom, this giant hippie lady. But man, is he anti-tree hugger to the point where he'd be just ranting and ranting endlessly. And at a certain point, I was just like, I get it already. You hate the hippies. Let's move on. Let's just get back to the plot. So that was a bit much. Oh, and there was this one scene that had me just. I was in bed. My partner was sleeping next to me. And I just couldn't stop giggling to myself. And I ended up having to close the book because I couldn't stop laughing through the scene. Where this one character, who was like a complete side character, we barely knew anything about them, gets this big scene where they decide to change their name and they want to be, treated as a different person. And our cop lead gets so excited, so over the moon, and it was just so ridiculous out of nowhere. And I was like, oh, Diane Carey, your dialogue at times is just, I don't know what you're going for. But either way, Aliens DNA War, really fun book. One I'll definitely return to. I gave the thing a 6.9, and I still have a lot of fun memories and can't wait to come back to it. Next, I read The Lock, published in 2005, written by Steve Alton. This one came as a recommendation from a friend of mine who read this book several years ago and had been kind of raving about it for years, that he just really enjoyed it, loved the conspiracy elements, loved the delving into this kind of cryptid mythology. And I was always curious. I was like, okay, sure. I was taking a plane at the time and I was just like, why not pick this up? Maybe I can listen to it on the plane for a little bit when I don't feel like reading the next book on this list. Or one of the next books, I should say, anyway. And so I decided to check this one out. I did come across a barrier right at the start, which is I found the narrator extremely grating. Definitely when I return to The Lock the next time, I'll be reading it in print because the narrator really was a barrier for enjoyment at times. But overall, I quite liked the book. It centered on this scientist character. It was a little bit of an asshole, a little bit of an annoying asshole, this guy. I mean, he was just really smug and he was prone to all these violent thoughts. Like he had a lot of anger in him and he would just think a lot of really nasty stuff at times. And he was always going on about like left brain versus right brain stuff. He was going on about that way too much. but he was investigating kind of his family heritage and all kind of wrapped up in Loch Ness. And throughout the book, as he was investigating that, we would cut in chapters of having like going into the actual claim sightings. It was like they would open the chapters with, oh, at this date, this person thought that they saw. And I thought learning about that stuff was pretty cool. But I especially just enjoyed learning about the loch itself. I've always been fascinated by bodies of water, wetlands, very much intrigued me. I've always been kind of obsessed with them a little bit, which is one of the reasons I really like the Willows as well. And this book goes a lot into the unique properties of Loch Ness and how that body of water has kept the mystery of the Loch Ness monster alive all these years. Certain qualities of Loch Ness, even though it's not that big of a body of water, you would think, how could it hide this giant sea monster? There's certain unique properties about it that make it more plausible. And again, I'm not saying I necessarily believe in the Loch Ness monster. I would say that I decidedly don't believe in it. But going into a lot of those actual science stuff helped make the science fiction elements with the Loch Ness monster, or fantasy elements, you could say, I don't know, made that stuff more credible. And it just overall gave the book a little bit of a kind of science thriller or techno thriller. Not quite techno, but it added to the thriller element. And I just liked it. The book had a really good pace to it. And just overall, I just came away really enjoying it as just a fun little, kind of silly but enjoyable little piece of mystery thriller fiction. And yeah, I just really enjoyed it. And definitely will return to this, but not in audiobook form next time. Definitely not. But I gave that one a 6.4. Yeah, solid book, a lock. To continue with this same section, the next one I went through was Alien vs. Predator Rift War. This one was written by two authors, one of the ones I mentioned previously, Weston O'Chase, hopefully that's how you say that, and Yvonne Navarro. This one was published in 2022, and this one was not a positive experience. This one I went through in audio. It was just a very mixed bag. The use of profanity was one of the things that stood out the most. It's rare that you read a book or see a movie even where the profanity is trying so hard that it constantly stands out to you and you're just like, wow, the way that they just used that word doesn't even feel natural or like any use of that word that I've ever heard before. I kept wondering, like, what are they going for here? Why do they have to use fuck so often? And again, it became grating. And I'm not someone who's sensitive to, coarse language. I myself am a bit of a sailor, but it just felt unnatural and weird and kind of embarrassing at times, even, I'll say. I didn't like any of the human characters at all. Even the brief glimmer of one that I might have liked was underutilized and then quickly dispatched without any care, and it almost just put me off the book, really. The setting was cool. The Rift planet, I won't go into too much about it because it kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of a spoiler, but either way, there was some cool stuff in the setting and the concepts, but I just hated the delivery all around. The human characters were just grating and unpleasant. And we spent a lot of time with the Predators in this kind of training group that they were doing. It was like, yeah, it was basically a big training mission was the book. And the human characters were doing their thing in this dangerous environment. The Predators were like, this is a perfect environment for us to teach our Predator young how to engage with, a hunt in a troubling, space, or a hostile terrain. And I just, I know that the comic books have explored this a lot, but it was the first time that I'd really been confronted with how they've developed the Predator society in the expanded world. And whenever I would hear stuff about the Predator society, before I read this book, I'd always be turned off and I'd always be like, oh, it feels like they really took something away. And I never really want to delve into that fiction. And I wasn't expecting it to be here. And so when we're really just spending time with them as if they're regular characters, seeing inside their heads, learning about them, seeing how their society functions. And they always call themselves the Yautja. I can't remember how you say it. Yautja. I don't know. Every time it was grating. And every time I was like, wow, this is a perfect example of the more that you try to expand these characters, the less interesting you make them, the more you take away the mystery. And even more so, they kept hammering in the book about how noble and kind of, this is a race that we should, revere as something they're so honorable. But I kept being like, no, the predators aren't honorable. Just because they have rules to their hunts does not make them respectable. They're still going out there trophy hunting, just killing people, and they claim, oh, as long as they don't have as long as they have a weapon, we can kill them. That makes us honorable. But yeah, you got a mounted laser cannon on your shoulder. I've got just a pea shooter, a pistol. Yeah, so honorable of you. you know, Not to mention being, I don't know how many times it's stronger, but obviously way stronger, way taller, way more powerful, way more advanced technology. And so it just feels stupid in my mind. And in this book, when they kept trying to hammer, oh, we should really revere this race, it just felt like it just felt dishonest to me. And it just felt stupid. Maybe that's a bias on my part. Maybe I should, if I explore more of the comics, I've always had a bias. I've always scoffed at any of that expanded fiction without having read it. I'm not necessarily judging the quality, but just saying, oh, I don't want to engage with that. I don't want to engage with that vision of the Predators. I feel like it would take away the mystery. Definitely took away the mystery for this book, but I don't factor any of that stuff into the movies, so I can easily dismiss it. Just as easily as I can dismiss this book. Yeah, I didn't hate it, but it is a very solid thumbs down and a very solid would not return to. I gave it a 5.2 just because I really liked the setting. And some of the alien stuff was admittedly cool, but the Predator stuff, yeah, not cool. Next, still in the same section, you can see in between Children of Dune and the Three Body Problem, I took a pretty big break here. But my next one in this list was Angels and Demons, published in 2000 and written by Dan Brown. I hadn't mentioned, it hadn't really come up yet. Dracula was really the first example of me looking at my bookshelf and trying to decide, okay, I've got so many books on my bookshelf that have been sitting there for years, and I've either tried to read them or never tried. And because I was going through my Audible library to put together my main playlist, I was like, maybe I should look to my bookshelf and just try to go through some of the books on there. One of the books that I tried to pull out was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. I have an illustrated edition of that book, and I'd always meant to get around to it. But as I was reading it, I started to get the sense very early on. I was like, wait a minute, is this a sequel? And so I looked it up, and turned out it was. Again, I don't really know anything about Dan Brown or his books. I just knew that I picked up an illustrated edition of Da Vinci Code several years ago and never got around to reading it. And so I realized, okay, before I can go through Da Vinci Code, I better quickly just pick up an audiobook and try to get through Angels and Demons as quick as I can, because I was already like 4 chapters in. So I just wanted to kind of get through it so I can continue with the Da Vinci Code. And Angels and Demons, this one was kind of silly in its way. The mystery itself was okay. It had a really kind of almost formulaic, but effective way of each chapter would kind of end in a cliffhanger in a way that would make you go, oh fuck, like they just escalated, I better jump to the next page. And sometimes they didn't necessarily deliver. It was like the cliffhanger was almost a little bit of like a little bit of a false lead or a little bit of a false promise, but it still kept me interested, kept me coming back. And eventually I finished it. It wasn't necessarily my jam. I was able to get through it pretty quick, but I just started to grow tired of the formula. I could really start to feel it by the end, and I would start to roll my eyes like, okay, come on, let's change the dynamics here. Let's do something new, not these constant kind of teases. And I thought the 2 leads were okay, but nothing special. The setting was cool, but I wasn't really interested in the Vatican or Catholicism in general. In fact, I always am kind of put off by that setting. And so that didn't help. And the mystery itself, honestly, was not that great. I didn't predict it, but I also wasn't actively trying to solve it because I wasn't that engaged with it. I was just kind of passively letting it play out, not particularly engaged or enthralled. There was some weird stuff in it. Some of it I thought went a little bit tasteless at times, with some bits of violence I just felt weren't necessarily needed to go there in this book. But there was a good twist at the end that kind of helped pull me back in and overall made it feel a little bit less silly. But I didn't necessarily enjoy it, and so I most likely would not reread it. I gave it a 6.0. It was passable. I'm planning to continue with the Da Vinci Code, although this experience made me really not want to continue, because after I finished this, I did continue with the Da Vinci Code for a few more weeks, and in print, I just started to feel less and less drawn to it, because that pattern had baked itself in so much from going through Angels and Demons in a very short amount of time, that every time I returned to Da Vinci Code, I was like, man, the formula is just getting so formulaic. And so I just, struggled to continue. But I am planning to get back. I may have to start Da Vinci Code from the beginning, because it was like February when I was going through it at that time. And now it's January 2025. And so maybe I need to do that. But the last one for this little section is The Ruins, published in 2006 and written by Scott Smith. And this was a very strong read. Went through this one in audio. I love the setting to this story. I love the mystery of the vines on this ruin that our group of cast is trapped on. It starts out with some young people on vacation. They're kind of carefree. They have their own little minor issues going on, but they're mostly carefree. They're mostly all getting along. And they wind up getting themselves trapped on this ancient ruin. And the creepiness of this book slowly reveals itself throughout. I think a lot of the way it builds and unveils its mystery is just great, very creepy, and I love the weird dynamics with the various characters. Two of them are these characters they call the Greeks, and they can't speak English, which is what the rest of the cast can speak, and so they only they got along as like drinking buddies and just kind of fun people to hang around with, even though they couldn't understand each other. That was kind of the humor. It was just, we can kind of just feel the vibe and get along that way. But very quickly, as they're on the ruin, the language barrier becomes a big problem for them. And a lot of that stuff I thought was just awesome. And overall, it was just a really good horror novel. And the reason I finally decided to go to it, I did see that movie that they made in 2008, but it had been a number of years since I watched it. But reading The Willows with Johnny and Isaac, it started making me think about the ruins again. And I was like, oh, I want to go rewatch that movie. And then I was like, oh, maybe I should check out the book instead. And I'm so glad I did. But oh God, I will warn, if you're sensitive to body horror and kind of some, just ugly body horror stuff, you may not enjoy this book, because there is a number of moments that really had me squirming around uncomfortably when I was reading it, or listening to it, I should say. And oh boy, yeah, it gets nasty. But really good. I liked all the characters, had a great sense of pace, great sense of mood, and just overall a book that I just can't wait to return to. It was a really good one. I gave that one a 7.5. So I won't go into this one too much, because this is actually the book that I'm picking for this year's podcast me and Brianna are doing on our favorite books of 2024. But this one, My Sweet Audrina, published in 1982 and written by V.C. Andrews. This was the only book that she wrote that wasn't part of a greater series. This one was a standalone, and oh boy, is this a fascinating book. I read this one 43% in print, the rest in audio. The reason for that is I started this when me and my partner took a trip to Mexico. This was the book I started reading on the plane, and I read that 43% in Mexico. But when we came back, there was just a lot going on, a whole bunch of stuff kind of causing some chaos in my life. And I fell off this book, and I didn't come back to it for maybe like 3 or 4 months. And when I came back to it, it was like, oh no, my reading list has like 9 books on it right now. Crap, I just want to get through them all. And so I just listened to the rest. I just picked it up on audiobook. I'm like, screw it. There's only a few hours left. I'll just get through this, and then I can knock it off my reading list. But oh man, this is just such a great book. There's so many strange parts to it. The characters are all really eccentric and disturbing and scary. It's kind of a gothic horror type story, centers on this poor child, Audrina. I think she's only about 9 at the start of the story, but we really don't know because her parents don't tell her her age, and her perception of time is all fucked up. She'll like take a nap, wake up, and they'll be like, "Oh, like Audrina, it's been like 2 months." And she says that she has Swiss cheese memory because she can't remember anything past a certain point in her life. And yeah, everything's all kind of hazy for her. And all the people around her are clearly keeping secrets, and they're, like I said, just strange and eccentric. And they seem to all despise each other. And she has this sibling, Vera, who is just a troubled little girl. She hates Audrina. She's always trying to steal her stuff and chasing her around, but she's got brittle bones. So Audrina will be chasing her to like grab, like get her thing back, and then Vera will fall over, and oh no, there she goes, breaking her arm again or breaking her leg again. And she just despises Audrina. And one of my favorite bits about the book, it's so crazy. Again, I won't talk about this too much because we'll be going into it more in depth, is Audrina is the second daughter in their family named Audrina. The first one, Vera was a cousin, by the way, I should have said. But the first one was named Audrina, and her dad is just obsessed with the gift that supposedly the first Audrina had, the first and best. And he always makes the second Audrina sit in this rocking chair in her sister's room to try to capture that gift. And he's always comparing them and being like, why can't she be as good as the first Audrina? And so the ghost of her sister kind of haunts her. And there's all this mystery around the sister's death. And yeah, it's just a great book. I would highly recommend this. I give it an 8.5. Again, tune in for me and Brianna do our podcast more fully on this one because I got a lot of things to say. This is one of my favorite books that I read this year that wasn't part of a series. Next one from 2018 is Alien: The Cold Forge, written by Alex White. This is the first of 2 books by Alex White in the Alien series that I read this year. This one, I should say, actually was in audio, so I listened to it. But yeah, again, like I said, there had been some chaos going on. I took a big break from reading at the time and listening to books. And so when I returned to this one, it was kind of a like, oh, I just got through my Sweet Audrina. I've got all these other books sitting on my list, but I really just want to listen to an Aliens book. And so this was the one I selected. And what a great one to return to the wild world of the Alien franchise, because this was a really good one. This one really got me back on the horse for going through some books. One of the things I really like about this one that stands out against the other Alien books, because like a lot of them, this one does take place on a ship that's doing some experiments on aliens, typical stuff that we've seen again and again in this franchise. But they just kind of play around with the tropes and the formula to make them feel expansive in a way that I've rarely seen in these books. And to be honest, you didn't really see that much in the movies either. We have this scientist that not only is someone that's been working on these aliens for her own means, not for the Weyland-Yutani. She's got her own secret agenda, and she ends up using this rival company to kind of help bolster her own purposes. All that kind of intrigue I really liked. But also, she's got this debilitating disease, and she's dying throughout the book. She's confined to a bed, and so she has to use this android body to do all of her scientist work, all of her testing and stuff. And so that's cool. That's something we've never seen, is using these androids as an avatar for yourself. That's a cool way to expand on the alien universe while incorporating these tropes. And another thing I liked is we had this corporate asshole, this sociopath who idolizes the synthetics and tries to model himself after them. He sees them as like the perfect beings, the beings that embody what he needs to be the perfect man. And he's super obsessed with fitness and very much obsessed with dominating and yeah, just lording over people. He's a really creepy lunatic, really. But he also gets emasculated anytime he's in the presence of a synthetic. And I thought a lot of that stuff was just really curious and interesting character work. And again, expanding on how this greater universe could influence the people who live in it. And I thought that a lot of that stuff was really cool. I would say the book went a little bit long, And some of the horror stuff didn't quite hit as strong as something like Alien Prototype, but still a very good Alien book. I really, really liked this one. This was maybe my third favorite. I gave this one a 6.8. And next, this one came because in the cycle that I was in at that time, because like I mentioned, I was going through my to the scattered to your scattered bodies goes to your scattered bodies go the stars series, and in each one I would have a section where I would read 3 books, and then kind of in between I would try to go through some other books. And right before I read this next one, I just finished up Jurassic Park, and I was just in the mood for some more dinosaur books. And so I was just kind of looking around doing some research. Okay, what are some books that feature dinosaurs? And one of the ones that came up was Meg, published in 1997, written by Steve Alton, the same guy who did The Lock earlier. And so it was like, oh, okay, I just did The Lock. I quite like that book. Maybe I'll just, and this audiobook, by the way, was available as part of the Audible Plus plan. So it was just right there. I didn't have to pay for it. It was just, access right away. And so I was like, sure, I'll just go through Meg. I did see that movie when it came out, and it was not a particular standout. But I was like, screw it, why not? I'll check out this Meg book. I liked The Lock. And honestly, I like this one. I really liked the opening where we see a T-Rex falling prey to the Megalodon. That was a really great way to just immediately jump me in. But that's really the only bit of dinosaurs that we see. But it was just definitely a grabber of an opening. But after that, the book was fairly fast-paced. I liked the lead here much better than the one in The Lock. Um, the scientists were all kind of, they're action book scientists. They weren't, like Jurassic Park, super into the details and the mechanisms, how everything worked. They skip around with the science a little bit more, and they keep this thing a fast-paced kind of action horror book. But it's all set around the sea, of course, since we have this megalodon and deep sea exploration. So a lot of stuff that it's just in my wheelhouse, stuff that I enjoy. This was touching on. And some of the visuals that are presented in the book are really great, really paint the scenes well. And the shark itself, the megalodon, I think is a cool threat that they use very well. And all around, just a fun, fast-paced little action, a horror book. A little bit more action than horror, but, mix them in. And I gave that one a 6.5. I don't have too much to say about it. It was just an unexpected delight, really, really. And I ended up going through most of these books this year. Yeah, I really was not expecting much coming in. I was like, oh, Meg, like, I don't know, whatever. I like bad shark movies. Am I going to like a bad shark book? But it ended up not being bad. So, and after that, I returned to a book that I'd listened to several years ago, maybe around the time that me and Isaac first did our Star Wars retrospective. I think I went through this book right before that. And that's Star Wars Heir to the Empire, published in 1990, written by Timothy Zahn. Wow, I just want to say the audiobook for this. I've not read it in print. I would like to do that at some point, but the audiobook is just great. Mark Thompson, the narrator, does a great job doing impressions of all the characters. He really does capture their voices really well and capture the feel of them well. Timothy Zahn gives us some stuff that, as a Star Wars fan, I was missing, especially in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And that's our core group of characters working together towards a goal. Those other 2 films, they split up the characters, and we kind of miss out on some of that fun banter and charisma and chemistry that all those characters have together. This book gives us plenty of moments to see that return. And Thrawn as a villain is, he lives up to all the expectations that you may have heard as a Star Wars fan. Thrawn exceeds them. He's really strong here. And all around, the characters themselves are really strong. The story's fast-paced. It sets up a whole bunch of new stuff for this little trilogy, but it sets it up in a way where it all feels natural. It doesn't feel like, oh, okay, here's the building block for next time. You're not going to know the answer. It still feels like it tells a satisfying story in itself, and it still feels like it comes to a good conclusion point. But there's lots of little dangling threads around that you can't wait to see resolved. And just all around, a very worthy successor to the original trilogy. And come back to it the second time around, all the way through. was definitely a success. I gave that one a 7.9. Next, and again, I won't talk about this too much because you can go right to our bigger review of it. Me and Brianna reviewed the book Rouge, published in 2023, written by Mona Awad. So yeah, you can look at the review on here if you want a bigger perspective. I'll just give the brief little rundown here. A very fun little fairy tale retelling of the Beauty and the Beast kind of story. The lead character is one that I enjoyed spending time with, and overall the world itself is one that I enjoy spending time with. She gets kind of wrapped up in this cult, this group of people that are obsessed with beauty, and a lot of the book is about image and what image it does for you yourself, how it makes you feel, and about how you present to others. A lot of that stuff I found interesting. There's a lot of interesting discussion about colorism, how that can affect image, and I also just found the book to be very funny and kind of surreal in ways. Again, if you want a bigger look at it, please go and listen to our full episode. I think that we dived into a lot of details in that, so I won't say too much here. Just that I gave it a 7.8. Definitely a book that I returned to. Mona Awad is an author that I've enjoyed checking out her work, and this one's my favorite so far of what I've read. I think I'll just do 2 more for this one, and then I'll save all the rest for next time because there's still many more books to come, and yeah, we're already getting close to an hour. For this next one, this was published in 1999. It's the sequel to Meg, so also written by Steve Alton, and this is The Trench. Now, this ended up being one of my least favorite books that I went through during this year. This one was also an audio. Didn't dislike it quite as much as That Hideous Strength, but The Trench did have a lot of hideous aspects of it as well. They needlessly introduce the villain of it has this Russian sidekick girl, and there's a lot of uncomfortable sexual assault stuff that they toss in with all this Russian group. A lot of just tasteless stuff that felt like it had no presence in such a fun, like that first book was just fun, kind of action horror, a little bit of science fiction thrown in, and it just had a snippy pace. This one was kind of bogged down in a lot of character stuff that I didn't really find that interesting. And then all this edgy sexual assault stuff felt like, whoa, what are we doing here? This is not fun. And it was a huge turnoff. Way too much not interesting intrigue with these Russians, a lot of like maneuvering behind the scenes, and none of it was particularly compelling. Um, Needed more shark schlock. I did kind of find it fun that a lot of the action in this book took place on Vancouver Island. There was a lot of stuff with the sharks around there, so that was kind of cool. And whenever we did get to the shark action, some of that stuff was pretty exciting, but it was just few and far between and way too much not interesting intrigue. I also thought it was interesting that Bin Laden played a part in the plot. He was part of this whole scheme that was going on, which is an interesting footnote considering this book predated 9/11 by 2 years. So, interesting note. I'll also say I think that the performance of the audiobook may have affected my feelings as well. I didn't like the production choices in this book. Some of the audio quality was just not quite there. And all the Russian accents were very off-putting and distracting. So it didn't help, especially in the scenes that were like really ugly. Like just, like I said, kind of a sexual assaulter guy just being perverse and grotesque. And then we have this comical Russian accent on it. It just did not pair well. It made the scenes even more grating. Yeah, so all around, I did not care for this book. I did decide to continue the series because I like the main character still, and I like the shark action. And when I read the premise for the next book, it immediately had me intrigued, and I was like, okay, I'll give it one more shot. But overall, this was on my bottom of the year list. I gave it a 5.1 because some of that shark stuff was still good enough, and I still liked our lead. But yeah, definitely a weak, definitely a speed bump, that one. But I think for the last book of this section, and you can hear all the rest in the next part. I'll end off with Star Wars Dark Force Rising, published in 1991, and once again written by Timothy Zahn. For this one, this may be my favorite of the series. I just think that there's so many fun elements in this book. They pick up a lot of the pieces that they left in the last one, and they amp them up and make them even stronger. There's some new plot lines, some new characters here. And I think the last one spent a lot of time dealing with political intrigue around the Republic, the New Republic government, and a lot of that stuff I liked. But I like the angle that they take this time more. I find there was a little bit less backbiting and more of like a bigger conspiracy going on, and a lot of that I think is pretty good. Thrawn definitely ups the stakes in a cool way, and this one has a really good kind of propulsive element where they're all the characters are all kind of going after a similar goal, and there's a time crunch. They all have to kind of, whoever gets there first is gonna change the nature of how things are gonna go in the third book. And so I think a lot of that stuff gives this one a really, really propulsive direction and pulls you through a little bit more than I feel like the first book did. And again, I like all the new characters as well and how the different dynamics that we saw built in the first one get a chance to change and flourish. And overall, I just think that this was a great sequel. And yeah, just this the Thrawn trilogy, again, it is a huge highlight. It's the only Star Wars expanded universe books that I've read. I really would like recommendations for other ones if anyone has any. But this second book, Dark Force Rising, definitely a highlight, and the one that and yeah, had me super pumped to get to that last one. Although it took me a while to get to there. I gave that one a 7.8. And like I said, that's where I'll leave it off for this entry. Many more books still to come. Far too many, in fact. So this might even go for another hour or so. But I hope you got something out of this. I've definitely enjoyed talking about the books that I've read in 2024. And there's still some really good ones that I can't wait to talk about for next time. But until then, I hope you keep reading in 2025. And I'm curious what books were your favorites in 2024. So shoot us an email if you'd like. But if not, just keep an eye on this feed, and the next part of this will pop out sometime in the future. Thanks.